Good evening. I'm Marian Dry, Chair of Class Act HR 73, and it is my honor to welcome you to this Class Act Forum, Protecting Half-Earth, Opportunities and Obstacles. Class Act forums bring experts and activists together to educate all of us about the issues we face in this complicated time and to provide us with strategic information about actions we can take to contribute to making this a better world. Let's get started. And in order to do so, I'd like to introduce our moderator, John Kress, and our panelists. Classmate John Kress is Distinguished Scientist and Curator Emeritus at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. He was Curator of Botany for over 30 years and formerly served as the Interim Undersecretary for Science at the Smithsonian and Director of Science in the Grand Challenges Consortia at the institution. He is currently co-chair of the Earth Biogenome Project, an international effort to generate complete genomes for all species of plants, animals, and fungi on the planet. John is currently writing the Smithsonian Guide to Trees of North America to be published by Yale University Press. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and received the Parker Gentry Award for Biodiversity and Conservation from the Field Museum of Natural History and the Edward O. Wilson Biodiversity Technology Pioneer Award, as well as serving as affiliate faculty at George Mason University. He is visiting scholar at Dartmouth College and the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. Keani Akina is a sophomore at Harvard College from Kahuku, Oahu, Hawaii. Keani studies environmental science and public policy with a focus on the Pacific Islands and indigeneity. In the summer of 2022, she worked for the Kuleana Coral Restoration, where they work to restore coral colonies on the outer Hawaiian reefs. Keani introduced the practice of Hawaiian Kilo, an indigenous practice of observation to better land and ocean stewardship. Keani hopes to attend law school and then return to Hawaii to work with her communities and to make better climate policy, incorporate indigenous knowledge into land management and restoration, and help Native Hawaiians get land back. Classmate Jason Clay, Senior Vice President for Markets, World Wildlife Fund, US, provides thought leadership on global issues and trends affecting food and the environment. He ran a family farm, worked at the USDA, taught at Harvard and Yale, and spent 15 years working with indigenous and displaced people. Jason is currently exploring new business models and markets to address producer livelihood and assets while reducing key impacts from producing food globally. He's leading a 2-year proof of concept with the Global Environment Facility, UNFAO, and World Bank to explore Codex Planetarius, a set of minimum global environmental standards that reduce the key impacts of producing globally traded food. David Foster is an ecologist, senior conservationist, and director emeritus at the Harvard Forest, Harvard University's 4,000-acre ecological laboratory, and president emeritus of the Highstead Foundation, which advances landscape to regional conservation in New England. David's research focuses on interpreting landscape dynamics from climate change and other natural and human processes, and applying these insights to conservation and management. In 2010, David and his colleagues developed Wildlands and Woodlands, a vision for the New England landscape that argues for regional forest and farmland conservation integrated with resilient community development for the benefit of nature and all people. The Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative is advancing through strong collaboration with Food Solutions New England. Christian Saint-Père is the managing director and leader of Nature Solutions at the Bezos Earth Fund and has served as president and chief executive officer of the Wildlife Conservation Society since 2012. Prior to joining WCS, Christian served as director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History and was the founding director of Colombia's Alexander von Humboldt Institute. He served as chair of the science advisory body of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and was one of the leaders of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's now my great pleasure to welcome John Kress to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Marianne, and welcome everyone this evening to tonight's forum on Half-Earth. I'm sure to many of us, the world seems to be in a rather sorry state these days, socially, economically, politically, but also environmentally, with the rampant loss of biodiversity and escalating global temperatures. But I also want to remind everyone that things have been worse. You can imagine that. 65 million years ago, at the end of the Cretaceous, an asteroid hit the planet, causing massive environmental destruction and species extinction, including, as most of you know, the demise of the dinosaurs. It was pretty bad. But out of that destruction arose a great expansion of new living things. Flowering plants expanded, new insects, birds, mammals, and one species began to form called Homo sapiens. The world of biodiversity got going again after that major impact of an asteroid. This is what Ed Wilson taught many of us as Harvard undergraduates in Biology 101 about 50 years ago. He taught us that life is unbelievably complex, that it is easily perturbed, but that it goes on. Ed Wilson was an inspiring teacher, a diligent scientist, and an unrelenting global environmental advocate. And after devoting his career to understanding and protecting nature, he came up with the idea near the end of his life that the only way to keep life going was by setting aside 50% of the planet as a zone to be protected long into the future. How long into the future? Well, for as long as it will take us, the single species that is causing this upheaval, to learn how to coexist with the other 10 million species on the planet. He called his idea Half-Earth, and he saw it as the only solution. Now, a little other history. In 1990, about 4% of land and oceans had been set aside as protected areas. Today, about 17% of the Earth is protected. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which recently had its 15th World Conference last December in Montreal, now calls for protecting 30% of all land and sea areas by the year 2030. That's about twice as much as is protected today. Now, this 30% goal has been echoed by many conservation groups and nations around the world, including the US. It is known colloquially as 30 by 30. Half-Earth goes beyond these ambitions by setting a target of protecting 50% of the planet. The question is, are any of these targets realistic and possible? Now, last October, Class Act 73 convened a panel of classmates in the same type of forum who have worked in the field of biodiversity and environmental conservation for a good part of their careers. That forum concluded that the goals of Half-Earth will require not only a major boost in land and sea protection by about 50%, but will also demand significant changes in our lifestyles, our utilization of natural resources, our economies, our cultural practices, and our political priorities. This sounds a bit like the hurdles that the planet faced back at the end of Cretaceous when the dinosaurs went extinct. The difference, though, is that today, this environmental crisis is being caused not by an asteroid, but by one species. Unlike that asteroid, we might be able to change course if we can muster the courage to do so. This evening, we have a second panel addressing Half-Earth and how it will unfold in the future, assuming that 50% protection is imperative to meet the challenges. Now, as you have heard from Marion in their introductions, all of the panelists are highly experienced and greatly motivated to solve the pressing environmental issues facing us. From major conservation NGOs and foundations, to biodiversity research institutes and environmental sciences programs. Our panelists have a direct connection to Harvard and the environment, either as faculty, students, or graduates, members of the planet. So that's a little introduction to get us going. We're going to divide the questions and the panel discussion into three main sections. The first round, I like to think of as setting the stage for thinking about Half-Earth. For this round of questions, I would like each of the panelists to begin with a short statement about themselves, about their interest in the environment, and why they decided to be on this panel in the first place. And then they can directly address the question I'm about to ask. So number one question, what are the drivers of environmental change that must be addressed as Half-Earth unfolds over the next 20 years? Okay, we're going to start with Christian Saint-Père. Christian, let us know what you think about what these drivers are.
Well, thank you, John. And it's great to be joining this panel to have this conversation, an incredibly important topic for all of us. As you heard in the introduction, I grew up in Colombia. And as a young kid, as a biologist, I spent time hiking in the Andes and actually ended up doing, while I was doing my PhD at Harvard back in the 1980s, some of the areas I worked in southwestern Colombia, I went out there, collected plants, documented these areas, only to find a few years later when I went back that many of these areas had been destroyed. It's at that point where you realize that as many tropical biologists, you can't just document extinction. You actually want to do something about it. And to be able to do something about it, you have to understand those key drivers and what are the changes behind that. And of course, we have to remember that even today, we have transformed about 73% of the land surface of the planet has already been transformed into various kinds of production systems. Some are highly degraded systems. And of course, most areas of the ocean have been impacted through fisheries. And you could argue every corner of the world is being impacted by climate change today. So we really have to understand if we want to tackle this biodiversity crisis. And one thing you didn't mention, John, of course, is that the recent NIPBES estimates and others suggest that about 1 million species may be in danger of extinction this century alone. That's about 1 million out of, depending on how you count them, at least 10 million species, not even going to microbial diversity. It's a whole other can of worms, no pun intended. But the IPBES report is actually sort of really honed in on five, what they call direct and indirect drivers. The direct drivers are five main categories: the transformation of habitats, the overexploitation of species that have particular commercial value, climate change, which we can talk about more later, pollution, and invasive species, which is critical, especially for island ecosystems and for some freshwater systems. And of course, behind all of these, you can find demographic, cultural, economic, institutional, and many other kinds of indirect drivers. So to be able to set aside these problems, we have to move ahead and protect some of the key areas of the planet. My personal view is we have to make sure we secure those key places that are still left, but we also have to restore some of the areas that we have lost. So we do not have 30% to protect. We actually have probably less in many of these places, and we are going to have to rebuild, restore, rewild some of these areas. But in the end, most importantly, we have to transform the way that we live. And that's an absolutely critical issue for all of us. That means, and we can talk about it later, how do we live? How do we get around? What do we eat? All of these are issues because we have to reduce the pressures on these natural ecosystems and make sure we address this. And of course, the challenges and the solutions, as we'll hear in this panel, vary widely across different continents. Whereas the Eastern United States was largely cleared and is already coming back in many areas. I'm sure David will talk about this. We see that in a continent like Africa, the estimate is the population is going to double. The demands are there. Poverty and conflict are going to have huge impacts that are only going to be exacerbated by things like climate change. So I think the solutions are going to be different for different countries, different continents, and different regions. And I look forward to discussing these as part of the panel this evening.
Christian, thank you very much. I wanted to point out, when you were that graduate student hiking through the mountains of Southern Colombia, I think we met for the first time at La Planada, if you remember that.
That's absolutely correct. That's what that, and I remember going and collecting some heliconias.
Yeah.
John, one thing I remember, John and I, of course, overlapped later when I was director of the National Museum of Natural History, and we worked on a whole bunch of things together, John. But thank you so much. I know one of the great honors was that you actually named one of the species of your beloved heliconias after me. from Colombia. And that's a way of documenting these incredible species. And our task is to make sure that we protect them for future generations.
Well, Chris-John, you deserved it. So, okay, we're going to go on to Jason Clay. Jason, give us some idea of your thoughts on drivers of environmental catastrophe right now.
So let me talk a little bit about my background, because I think of the people on the panel, I've actually in the 1980s set up a company to try to prove that the rainforests were worth more as rainforests than they were as either cattle ranches or soy fields. And we tripled the price we paid to producers for things like Brazil nuts or acai, which you can buy now readily in the US markets, et cetera. But ultimately we failed because we underestimated the power of the ranchers and the soy producers to move into regions like the greater Amazon, but also the Cerrado in Brazil. So I think I took away from that lesson that we really need to focus on the commodities that are driving destruction of many parts of the world, in particular food production, which has had the biggest impact on the earth of any human activity. The reason food, I think, in this context is so important for half Earth is that we already use or have degraded and discarded half of the land to produce food. One activity in the history of people. At this point on land, food is responsible for 70% of habitat loss, biodiversity loss, more than 70% of water used by people, a third of all greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of that is from deforestation. That's the single largest cause. But it also uses more chemicals than any other sector. It pollutes soil, fresh water, marine environments. We have lost about half of the topsoil on the planet, and this is going to affect our ability to be resilient in food production going forward. As the global population has increased, has aged, has gotten wealthier, and has had access to globally traded food, we've increased production through technology and efficiency, but also through the expansion of food production. And that's where I think it might be better to call it agricultural sprawl. That is what we've been doing in lieu of expanding and producing more with less. So today, we've altered half of the land area. We've just added another billion people in the last 12 years. We're going to add another billion people in the next 15 years, and we'll be almost up to 10 billion by 2050. They will consume more, and they'll consume differently, especially animal proteins. And we've seen, even with all the awareness about animal proteins, the consumption of animal proteins is increasing faster than most other food categories. The numbers don't lie. Population is a big driver, but consumption is equally important. The average American consumes about 30 to 40 times the amount of food as the average African. A cat in North America and the EU consumes in its lifetime about the same amount of resources, food resources, as the average African. So to date, we know that when there's a choice between a starving child and a tree, the tree is going to lose every time. So to prevent such choices, we need to shrink the footprint of food. We know that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions generally by about 80% by 2050. What most people don't understand is that we need to reduce absolute uses of many other things. How do we reduce from food, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also land used, water used, agrochemicals used, other inputs used? How do we do this? It's easy to say, much harder to do. We can increase productivity and focus on soil and genetics. We can increase efficiency, use fewer inputs, focus on biology more, and agrochemicals and chemistry less. We need to reduce food loss and waste. We currently waste about a third of all the food. That means for every 2 kilocalories we consume, we waste 1. We could increase by 50% the amount of food available if we eliminated food waste. These are all things that are easy to do. Shifting consumption is probably where we could make the biggest reduction, and it's also one of the things that's going to be the hardest to work on. And that's reducing especially animal proteins being consumed, and then all the feeds that are fed to them as well. We know how to do these things. The question is whether we will or not.
Jason, thank you very much. Extremely pertinent to the entire world, to say the least. Okay, here's a second question. We dealt a bit with the drivers, and this is a question I'm often asked about Half Earth in terms of what is a protected area. So the question is, how do we best define a protected landscape? And especially with regards to the rights and histories of Indigenous people and local communities, as well as current land use, whether it's for agricultural use or other types. So Kiani Akina, could you please address your thoughts about what is a protected area?
Yeah, aloha kako. Again, my name is Kiani Akina, and just I guess a little bit of a background. I'm a current sophomore at the college studying environmental science and public policy, and I'm in Elliott House. I know there's a lot of Harvard alum on here, so Elliott House, best house. And a lot of my research and focus here in undergrad has been around traditional ecological knowledge in Pacific Islander communities and other Indigenous communities as well. And so I guess like to get into this question a little bit, it's much more nuanced than I guess it initially seems. And so I wanted to start with the general definition that I think is accepted by many conservation organizations and Americans, which is from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. And they define a protected landscape as areas of national significance, which are characterized by the harmonious interaction of man, land, and water, while providing opportunities for public enjoyment through recreation, tourism, and other economic activities. And so I think there's some crucial things that can be improved with this definition and maybe even redefined. But just for today, I want to focus on one piece of it, and it's the last part, which is providing opportunities for public enjoyment through recreation, tourism, and other economic activities. So many Indigenous peoples, including Native Hawaiians, which I'm Kanaka Maoli from the Ahupua'a of Ko'olauloa. And so we understand that we as humans, we can't own land. Rather, we're in a familial relationship with one another. And in Hawaii, we regard land as our kupuna, or our elder or ancestor. And we understand this through the kumulipo, which I actually have a copy of it right here. And this is our Hawaiian creation story. And so it was traditionally passed down through oli or chant. But today, obviously, we have it written down in Hawaiian and also in English, which I'll provide for anybody who's interested to read later. But through the kumulipo, like we understand today that our relationship with protected landscapes is a familial one, because our ocean relatives and our land relatives came before us as humans. And our first relative is the coral in the ocean. And this is actually what drove me to do the restoration I did over after my freshman year in the summer of coral restoration and Indigenous science studies. And so through all of this, I think it's clear that our relationship with protected landscapes should not be contingent on the value that it can provide for human benefit, but instead we should be incentivized to protect and steward land because it's our elder, it's our predecessor, and therefore it also has the right to exist just like we do. And so I think while Half Earth is a bold and a very inspiring call to action, and a protected landscape, it sounds comforting, I think both are still very anthropocentric. And it presents a human-centric view of nature and an approach to protect lands and waters and oceans for the benefits of humans. So I think we need a more inclusive and a holistic approach to protecting biodiversity. So I want to introduce a framework instead of a definition for us to think about surrounding protected landscapes. And I want to look at it through the lens of human-nature relationships, which we describe as kin-centric ecology. As I mentioned earlier, Indigenous folks are in a reciprocal relationship in which humans are stewards to the land as their kin. And kin-centric ecology is an area of focus that Dr. Salmon has built upon for many years. And I believe that if we can create a societal shift that protects and embeds nature as a relative and a part of our identities, that we can better steward land and protect biodiversity. And I think kin-centric ecology is is a place-based Indigenous practice, and the keyword is place-based, as it differs in different regions of the world. It differs on every Pacific island that you go to. It differs even within different parts of Hawaii, just as it differs with different Indigenous tribes here on the continent. But I want to acknowledge that if we are to incorporate this version of traditional ecological knowledge through kin-centric ecology, that we recognize its roots before implementing it into Western protection methods and Western science. And so I believe that most of us have heard some version of the factual statement that despite the fact that Indigenous people make up just 5% of the global population, they're protecting 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And this is evidence of just how crucial kin-centric ecology is, because this interconnection of kinship, of stewardship, and of knowledge is exactly what's protected 80% of the world's biodiversity. So implementing kin-centric ecology into protected landscape stewardship will require working with and learning with Indigenous communities. And I don't pretend to have all the answers for how we can implement this into American policy and Western farming and biodiversity and conservation systems. But I know it's feasible, and I've seen it in practice in the Zapotec Nation, where over 300 Indigenous environmental stewards are applying community-based forest management to protect their forests from illegal deforestation and logging. And I've also seen it in Hawaii through community subsistence farming, with fishing and with taro farms.
Yanni, thank you very much for that perspective and all those ideas. That adds greatly to expanding our idea of what a protected area is and where it comes from, to say the least. Okay, let's move on to David Foster. Give us some ideas from Harvard Forest and from what you've seen on the idea and the definition of protected areas.
Thanks very much, John. It's wonderful to be here as part of this forum. Just to add a bit of detail to the background, which will explain the approach that I take. I arrived at Harvard in 1983 as a junior faculty member in organismic and evolutionary biology. And although I spent my early years, like most new faculty members, working to build my resume and secure as strong a base as I could at Harvard, by the time that I, at a very early age, became the director of the Harvard Forest in 1990, and the head of the long-term ecological research program based there, I became convinced that all of what we were doing in our research base was for naught if we didn't apply it directly to the way that land is managed, land is conserved, and people ultimately live their lives in relationship to the land. And the last half a dozen years or so, as I was director of the forest, I chose to move from Petersham, where I was based and where 50 people work daily as part of the Harvard Forest, into Cambridge so that I could actually take a greater part in engaging with students, engaging with other faculty, and really trying to advance this kind of conservation and ecological agenda across a greater part of the university. And so what I'd like to do today is to actually draw mostly from work that takes place in Harvard's backyard, the 42 million acres that comprise the 6 states of the New England region, and talk in particular about work that comes from 2 efforts. This effort's wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities, which is a regional scale effort that started at the Harvard Forest, but now includes academics and conservationists and state and federal agencies all across the region, in which we actually propose goals for New England to set 80% of New England aside as conservation land. This is land which is 70% comprised of forest, recognizing that New England today is 82% forest covered. 10% of that would be in the strictest form of protection as wilderness or wildlands. We'd also ask to set aside about the 7 to 10% of land which is in agriculture. And the second study that I'm going to talk about and refer to is a new study that's coming out this next month in May, which tabulates and maps all of the wildland areas in New England. And this is actually the first time any place in one region in the United States that all of the public and private, so public, federal, and state, and municipal, and private, nonprofit organizations and individuals land which is dedicated to nature and to allow nature to be forever wild in a permanent way in which impact and management by humans is minimized. So what do those studies lead me to conclude is the single major driver of environmental change that we need to address? It's one that's been articulated already. It's land use. It's the conversion of forest lands and food producing lands into other types of land uses. And it's the degradation of intensively managed forests and farms. The three major crises that we're dealing with globally of climate change, biodiversity loss, and human welfare are all inextricably tied to land use change and all must be addressed simultaneously by looking at the way that we live and what we're dealing with the earth. And let me just give a few examples from our own backyard, that is our own Cambridge backyard in New England, at how little effort we actually pay to land use. So for the last 25 years, New England has been losing 25,000 acres of forest every single year. It's 82% forest cover, and we treat that just in a completely lackadaisical fashion. Even a state like Massachusetts has more than 60% forest, and yet Massachusetts has the highest rate of deforestation of any of the New England states. The single largest driver of that change right now is energy production, solar farms, and transmission of energy. Only 25% of New England is currently protected, and most states have extremely weak targets. For example, the state of Connecticut, which has between 19 and 20% land protected, has a state goal, a green goal, of reaching 20%. Only the state of Vermont, which has a bill in the legislation right now that proposes to conserve 50% of that state by 2050, is even coming close to the kind of broad and ambitious goals that we need. So let me just end by something I'll come back to, which is that academic institutions play a key role in informing people and acting on land use change. And that's something that we should consider much more within this forum and beyond. Thanks.
David, thank you very much. I want to extend some of the ideas that you just brought up in terms of protection and land use and ask you to talk a little bit about restoration. We know so much from what Jason said and Christian both said, we know so much of the land has already been degraded by us. What is it going to take in terms of restoration of land to get some of that back and actually protect this 50%?
Well, I mean, as Christian alluded, New England is a fabulous example for the potential of restoration. In the case of New England, it's actually passive restoration. 150 years ago, New England had half the forest cover that it does today. The vast majority of the land had been either cleared or intensively logged numerous times. And inadvertently, largely because of the opening of lands in the Midwest and the far West, which drew extensive agriculture out of the region and to other parts of North America, land on a vast scale was abandoned from active use or turned into less intensive use. And the response was absolutely phenomenal. Over the next century, there was a doubling of forest cover. And today, many parts of New England, it's very difficult to actually, for most people, walk in the woods to tell that the land has had that type of intensive use. Mm-hmm. And so I think it comes directly back to what Jason alluded to, which is the way that people behave on the land. And if we modify our behavior, lessening the intensity and the extent of our use, there's extraordinary potential for restoration, both naturally and through direct human activity.
Very good. Very good. Okay, Christian, I want to turn to you because I want to take us off the land and into the sea, or into 70% of the planet. I know you've been involved in some restoration projects in oceans. Do you want to talk about that a minute?
Sure, John, I'm happy to do that. And thank you for reminding us that the majority of the planet is covered by the ocean. And there are incredible things happening there right now. We've seen, you alluded to the figures of protection and protected areas for the ocean, but it's much less in the ocean than land. As a matter of fact, according to some estimates, we have about 7% of the ocean protected. If you look at real no-take zones, it's probably closer to 3%. So we have a long ways to go. We're looking at least, to get to 30%, we're looking at least 4 times the total area. Now, the good news is there's good progress being made in many areas. The United States has actually made a lot of progress in that regard. Thank you to some of the work that's happened in the Northern Hawaiian Islands and across the Pacific and many other areas. And a very important development just happened barely a month ago, which was a global agreement on what's called the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. Let us not forget that the majority of the ocean falls outside the national boundaries. And after 10 years of negotiations, or more than 10 years of negotiations, there's a global agreement to actually protect 30% of these areas beyond the national jurisdictions. So I think this is a good step forward. Now, we do know that even small locally managed marine protected areas can have a hugely positive impact in terms of local livelihoods because of spillover effect. And communities, for example, in places like Fiji and Madagascar and many others have set aside relatively small areas that we manage sometimes on a rotating base. And what we know is that if you build up the biomass there, if you have bigger fish, and they will automatically they'll lay exponentially more eggs and they'll spill over. And because of the ocean currents, even small protected areas can have a huge impact in terms of the restoration and the livelihoods of many people. So there's a win-win-win solution here that we need to pursue much more aggressively. For me, one of the most important things that we're working on is taking place in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. This is the area that spans from the Galapagos Islands through Colombia into Panama and Costa Rica and to Cocos Islands, where in Glasgow, just a year and a half ago, the 4 presidents of these countries came together and decided to create the largest transnational marine protected area that exists today. In just 1 year, the total area that's protected tripled from 200,000 square kilometers to more than 600,000 square kilometers. And of course, right now, it's not only about declaring them on paper, but managing them as a unit. So the additional element here is they've agreed to create a single biosphere reserve that will cover all 4 countries. And that will be a first, because we have to recognize that so much of biodiversity and certainly fisheries do not respect national boundaries. Just to give you an example, the iconic hammerhead sharks that are found in the Galapagos that divers love to go and see are breeding in the mangroves of Panama. So one of the things that we're doing right now is really strengthening the science, looking at the working organizations like Migramar to look at the migrations of these animals across these areas, and also exploring the seamounts, because we know so little about what's lying underneath the surface. And just today I was looking at a paper looking at a new underwater sea reef that was found in the Galapagos at 600 meters depth, completely new, unknown to science, that was just described thanks to some of the technologies that we have. So there's tremendous potential for what we can do here. It's good not only for conservation, but it's crucial for the fisheries. We need to look at not only protecting that 30%, but doing sustainable management of the other 70%. And of course, take into account the climate change, because we know climate is having huge impacts on the ocean. It's absorbing so much of the heat, and that's creating all kinds of disruptions that's impacting people and wildlife.
Great, Christian. That's just what I wanted to hear, and to include those marine environments and how we're going to deal with them as well. I mean, it's all connected. We can't separate these things, but it's good to get that perspective. Let's look at the other side of the coin a minute and go on to another question. And I'm going to ask this to Jason first. We're talking about protecting 50%. Well, what are we going to do with the other 50% that's not protected? We're obviously going to have to change what we're doing with that land area, or land and sea area. So Jason, what do you think about that? In both landscapes and marinescapes, what do we do with the 50% that's not protected?
I think part of the answer to that is, how do we bring nature and wildlife and biodiversity back into farming and back into food production systems? Every producer on land can produce more by actually taking land out of production and not wasting resources trying to farm land that's marginal. That land is perfect for producing carbon sequestration, for water retention and stream flow over the year, for clearer streams, less soil erosion. We need to begin to show land owners that there are other ways to make a living and to survive than simply by trying to produce commodity crops and in low price markets, et cetera. So I think we're going to see as we move forward that there will be more bringing nature into farming. That's because I think we do have to reclaim some of that land, and we've been working in Brazil on these kinds of things, including how do you reforest areas that have been cleared for ranches. One of the proposals I've just made recently to the Lula administration, the new president of Brazil, is that they put a 1% environmental levy on all commodities that are exported from the country, so that every buyer has to pay some of the environmental externalities of what that commodity production is producing, and then use that money to reforest critical areas, riparian areas, watershed areas, et cetera. We've even developed a model where we can take that money and leverage green bonds with it, where we have 30 or 40-year funding at lower interest rates that can be used to cover some of these same costs. But most important, I think we're also using the reforestation as a way to bring local communities back onto these lands. Most ranchers have very little labor. They can't afford to replant forest, and that's an expensive thing. But if we can help cover the cost of that and bring and pay communities to gather seeds, to produce seedlings when you need seedlings as opposed to just seeds, and then come in and replant it, and pay them also on the survival rate at 5 years, not just for getting a seed in the ground or a seedling in the ground, so that you actually have something. But here's the real part: the rancher is going to own the carbon that any tree sequesters, but the communities get collection rights to the nuts and fruits and essential oils. And we've already developed markets and contracts with Boticário and Natura in Brazil, two big companies that make personal care products, et cetera, to begin to look at bringing biodiversity back onto ranches in a very different way. So I think we're just scratching the surface on these kind of things. I just was reading a piece that showed that if we managed key large animals both in the ocean and on land, we could actually increase carbon sequestration. And the one example that came out of that I thought was really interesting was that if we had a $30 price for a ton of carbon, ranchers in the West would make more money growing bison than they would growing cattle without selling them for meat at all. Well, that's a whole different ballgame, and it really opens up the potential of a lot of land that probably has been used pretty marginally for a long time. So I think we've got to really think about how to shift existing productions, not just because because climate change is going to force us to anyway. I mean, the fisheries are moving 25 miles a year or something like 500 miles in 20 years. We've already documented that. Crops in the Midwest are moving about 20, 25 miles north a year. And so they're going to be having to come in with something later to grow. Well, why not make it biomass? Why not make it sequestered carbon? Let's find markets for those things. And then we also need to shift more production off farms entirely. Indoors, vertical ag, hydroponics. There are many ways to reduce the impacts of producing food, reduce the waste as well, make it more available in food deserts without actually always trying to till the soil to do it.
This discussion is getting more and more interesting with every comment. Kiani, how about you now? Maybe building on some of the things you said earlier about protected areas, maybe we don't even distinguish between protected and non-protected. But what are your thoughts?
I want to preface my thinking and my understanding for this by relying on the work of Dr. Jessica Hernandez. And she's coined the term eco-colonialism, which includes 3 layers. And so the first is the governing of natural resources without the consultation of Indigenous people and not respecting Indigenous sovereignty, which goes back to what I had mentioned earlier about protected landscapes. The second is the severe altering of landscapes because of settler colonialism and the ideologies that it's produced, which includes climate change. The third is the lack of resources offered to Indigenous peoples and communities of color that are already experiencing decreased biodiversity, climate change impacts, and displacement. And so I think for me, another concern with Half Earth poses this question of where are people going to go, and will this displace people, specifically Indigenous people? And I think a lot of answers to like caring for land and ensuring that that doesn't happen can be answered through this idea of kin-centric ecology. But I guess to specifically answer the question of what we do with the other 50% of land, I have a few ideas, but I think I mostly have questions. And so I guess to start, I think Indigenous people have converted deserts into gardens and dry lands into taro farms and numerous different landscapes into thriving ecosystems through their place-based kin-centric ecology. I believe that creating the opportunity for Indigenous stewardship on both sides of the Half Earth, both 50%, can protect biodiversity, create biodiversity, and also use land for what was mentioned earlier about carbon sequestration, which brings me to my next point. But I also want to highlight that I know that natural climate solutions and carbon sequestration is highly debated and heavily politicized. And so I'm not sure that there's a right answer for this. And I'm sure that many different people on the panel and viewers as well have different opinions on it. So I guess my next point is that we can use some of this land for quote unquote natural climate solutions and carbon sequestration, and especially for clean energy technology initiatives, so long as they're executed in a manner that is A, consulting the surrounding Indigenous and rural communities, and B, is something that is economically beneficial for those communities, meaning that the energy and the revenue stays either within that community or grants them the autonomy to figure out what they want to do with that energy. And I think actually a poor example of a clean energy initiative that that didn't remain in a community was actually what happened in my hometown in Kuhuku, Oahu. They built windmills right behind our elementary school and high school after the community repeatedly asked for them not to be built. And you can find more information on this by looking up Kuhuku wind turbines. And the energy doesn't stay within our community, and we have no autonomy over where it goes. And so it's redirected into Waikiki and into Honolulu, which are heavily tourist areas, and predominantly non-Hawaiians live there.
Yeah.
And so I guess to move on to, I guess, some questions that I would want to pose are just, how do we ensure that 50% of the land we are aiming to preserve doesn't displace Indigenous and rural communities? And in the case that it does, because of climate change migration, how do we ensure that people have access to continual cultural practices and kinship to the land? And how feasible and seriously realistic is splitting up our efforts into 50% protected land and then 50% non-protected? I think it may be a little idealistic, and I think we need a more innovative and realistic approach to biodiversity protection.
You know, Kiani, thank you. I think many would agree that Half Earth may be a little idealistic, but we chose it as a theme because it gives us an opportunity to think about all these things in a concrete way. Whether or not it'll go that direction, we'll see. But I want to move on to the last question. And Kiani, I'd like to start with you on this. And this gets a little bit more personal. Describe how you think your lifestyle and the lifestyle of peoples around you are going to have to change as we begin to change the planet. And we've already all alluded to this a little bit, but I'd like us to get into some concrete things, but also some idealistic things. But what are your thoughts about that?
I first, before I get into it, I want to make it very clear that I think that individual actions are important in solving the climate crisis as well as protecting biodiversity. And I think there are many things that we can do to make small switches, like buying biodegradable and reusable and recyclable items, and planting native species in our own backyards, and supporting the efforts of Indigenous communities who are rallying behind environmental actions. But I think in the grand scheme of things, our individual actions are not nearly as significant compared to our collective ones. Mm-hmm. And just like there's no one person to blame for creating this mess, there's not one person to clean it up. So I think we should focus on tackling the climate crisis and protecting biodiversity collectively rather than individually. And I think that's going to take brave and radical imagining on what our futures can be. And I think it's going to take courageous and young leadership in government and in policy and in science that are prioritizing the collective well-being of us and also future generations, which I think is equally as important. But I guess on a more personal level, I think it's obvious based off of all of my comments that I'm committed to sharing my own lived experiences and my knowledges as an Indigenous woman, as a Native Hawaiian woman, and will continue to spend like the rest of my college and professional career advocating for the implementation of traditional ecological knowledge. And I think there's a time in my life where I was vegan for a few months, and I really was like, this is going to help. This is going to make a big dent on the impact. But I think there's a lot to be said about debunking the veganism movement. Again, another idealistic movement, although it will help if majority of us can go plant-based and whatnot. But I really think that if we can all just like focus on education and acting and participating in movements and in actions that are more collective, that we can make the biggest difference that way. And so I think it's going to take a lot of buy-in and serious critical thinking from all of us.
Well said. Well said. Christian, what do you think about lifestyles, and what are you thinking about you and your family and your children?
Well, let me start on that last point. That one of the things that really gives me hope is that next generation. I see my own children and people and their teenagers and others, the awareness that they have about the environment, around issues of environmental justice, like the ones we just heard, is really quite remarkable. I only wish I had had that opportunity and wisdom when I was a teenager. And yes, I think it does start at home, and it doesn't change the issues, but the personal choices everyone makes does have a role to play. Just to give you one specific example, I gave up eating tuna about 17 years ago. Just stopped eating it because I was so concerned about these issues. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's little actions like that that go a long way to the choices that we make about how we get around. One of the good things about the pandemic is we're getting used to these kinds of forums, so we don't have to fly around and go to all these events, and we can actually do it and reach many more people. So one of the personal choices I've been making is getting more involved, in particular with university settings, in trying to bring and have conversations with some of the next generation people being trained. And that brings me to another issue. Well, actually, one more personal choice that some of us have the opportunity of making is how we invest. The small choices about where we invest and putting some pressures. And fortunately, I think there's more and more awareness in some of the financial sector about some of these issues. And the choices we make can actually help influence some of these areas and redirect some of the funding away from this. I think I'm very encouraged by some of the recent movements that we've seen in the last few years. But the last issue that I'd say that this was a very personal choice that my wife and I made when we got married 20 years ago was really investing in training that next generation of leaders. So we felt it was important to create a fund in Colombia called Fondo Colombia Biodiversa, which is specifically designed to support students, undergraduate and graduate students in Colombia that are interested in the conservation, sustainable use, and understanding of biological diversity. And every year we give 10 of these fellowships, which are small contributions, but at the right point in your careers, a small boost, a little bit of money can really make all the difference so you can pursue a project in the right areas. So it's our own little way, and I'm very happy to say that 150 of them have been awarded to date. And some of them are now faculty in universities in Colombia and the United States. And we're getting what we call as biologists EF2. The students from those people that we supported are now sending us their students. So that is a way of helping build that through education. That's another personal commitment that we have made.
Thank you. Let's go on to Jason. What are your thoughts about lifestyles?
I think I'd like to just pick up on what other people have said. I think everybody eats, and we've got to get informed about what our choices do to the planet. We need to not just get informed, we need to vote. We need to vote about these things. It's not just buying something at the cash register that's produced better. It's also politically reinforcing the systems that could make it better. currently, at least from what I've seen, it takes about 2 generations of people coming out of poverty to shift diets. And I don't know why that is. I think it's because of what people see, how they are raised, et cetera. We don't have that kind of time anymore. So whatever we can do to bring our children, our grandchildren along these process, actually to follow them in their process, I think would be important. But we need to do that more quickly. And people are going to have to shift their diets. There's just no question about that, to reduce their footprints. It's going to mean eating less meat. Doesn't necessarily mean eating none, but we got to stop buying seasonal produce as well. I mean, out of season produce. We need to be focused on what is being produced where we live. Don't waste food, period. We all have to eliminate food waste from our kitchens, from, even from our guests, et cetera. And I think, what everybody can do is just try to produce some of their own food to see what it takes. It will make you a conservationist. It'll make you a food conserver faster than anything else. I'll leave it at that.
Well, that's a pretty good place to leave it. We're going to give David his last comments. You get the final comments on this question, and then we're going to move to some questions from the audience that have been listening so patiently to everything we've been saying here. So David.
Okay, let me pick up on a few things that have been mentioned, but also try to address a few that haven't. I think it's critical for all of us to actually look at the whole Earth, not half Earth. There are not and should not be any sacrifice zones. We should conserve at least 50% of the Earth, but we need to live with and near and observing and caring for nature, as well as securing nature intact in large expanses where there are relatively few people or people who are living very lightly on the land. Which means that we need to change our perspective. We certainly need to change our behavior in terms of our consumption pattern and our relationship to the land. I think to pick up on something that Yanni talked about early, we need to hold very near and dear in our efforts at conservation those lands that are secured for nature itself, out of respect for nature and the respect for relationships of humans and nature. And so the wildest of lands, the lands that are operating with as little impact by humans, should be especially in sight for us. Now, it turns out that in this study that we did in New England, if you look at 42 million acres, 3.3% of it is actually protected for nature in and of itself, a remarkably small amount and much lower than the at least 10% that we recommended back in 2010. And so we should embrace rewilding. We should embrace nature's ability to take care of itself. And let me just end on a note by saying there was this remarkably uplifting piece in the Washington Post by Rebecca Solnit a couple of weeks ago, which was entitled, "What if climate change meant not doom, but abundance?" And it comes from a book that she's releasing this month called Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility. I think that all of the behavioral changes that we're talking about, all the changes we're talking about in our backyards at a regional scale and globally, those should all be viewed so positively as improving the quality of life and the state of human beings. That's what we're trying to accomplish here. This is not austerity. This is not depriving us of riches and abundance. This is giving us focus on what's important and giving us a very different type of riches and abundance than we're used to valuing. Thanks, John.
Great, Dave. Before we go on to some questions from the people that have been listening to this, I'm wondering if any of you have any responses to something you heard another panelist say, or you have any further comments on anything that we've talked about.
John, I want to pick up on the comments that we heard Kiani say about indigenous issues and in particular tenure rights. Look, I completely agree that we know that many of these local communities, indigenous communities, have been stewards and guardians of these areas for a long time. And certainly the view we're taking toward something 30 by 30 is not only doing it in the right places, but doing it in the right way. And a huge part of the equation here is securing tenure rights for some of these communities. So for example, we're supporting the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities in a project that's gearing toward trying to secure the tenure rights of about 1 million square kilometers of tropical forest, recognizing that many of these areas have been, of course, been there for many, many generations, hundreds if not thousands of years, and yet they do not have this. We see this in Brazil right now. We see what's happening there, and yet some of the areas that we're looking at now are home to dozens of uncontacted and isolated tribes. So it's really important to make sure that these communities have the right to choose in terms of their own development. And I do agree that in many, many cases, these local communities have to really will be key stewards for on land and on sea. So I think that's a really important area. And I think today, fortunately, it is true that conservation has had a very troubled history in places like Africa, but there's a right way of doing this and looking at protected areas, not in the traditional sense, but looking at conserved areas and looking at the role of local communities in doing this. So I think that's a very important point. I just want to invite us all to embrace that as we move forward.
Chris John, thank you very much. Jason, yeah.
Sorry, one thing that has come up is just the trying to bring oceans into this and talk about them. And I think that as somebody who's looked at the transition from wild-caught fisheries into aquaculture, I just think we need to use a lot of caution when we're thinking about this. Aquaculture and blue food generally, we don't want to make the same mistakes in the ocean that we've made on the land. And it appears in many places that we're headed in exactly that right direction, the wrong direction. But I think that there are two other issues I'd just like to pose very quickly that we haven't mentioned yet. One is the projection that between 1 and 1.5 billion people will be displaced by 2050. We're already at 200 million. Imagine if 1 in 8 people, that's about 15 people on this call, were displaced. How a food system, how do protected areas, how are they defended against that? There's not enough barbed wire in the world. These are things that we need to think about. And then the other is the 10 to 15% projection of decline in net primary productivity because of climate change. We're going to have to swim harder to be treading water.
Is that your final statement there, Jason? Okay. How about David or Kiani? Do you have any further comments before we go to some questions?
I just wanted to comment real quick on both what Dr. Foster and Dr. Clay said. I think to add another perspective to what's going to happen with forced migration because of climate change, I think another important thing to keep in mind is that potentially puts indigenous peoples and people all around the world actually in a place where potentially culture will be lost and language and all of these things that I've shared with you guys about ways that we can protect biodiversity, like that this is how these knowledges are lost, is through forced migration. And so I also wanted to highlight that, and as well go back to what Dr. Foster was saying about this idea of like land first and prioritizing land. And we have it's not even a saying, it's more of like a way of life in Hawaii, and it's aloha aina. It literally translates to a love for the land. But it's actually more of something that I think most Hawaiians are actually born with. And it's like this responsibility to care and live with land. And I think, I didn't explain this earlier, but this is why I chose to study environmental science and public policy here, because I definitely more of a humanities girl myself, but chose this because that's just part of my responsibility. Because I'm so privileged to be Hawaiian, I was born with this responsibility to care for and advocate for my ocean and land and water relatives. And so I just wanted to bring that like piece of knowledge we have in my culture to this conversation too.
Great, thank you very much. David, any last comments or should we dive into some questions?
I want to dive into questions, but let me just thank Kiani and say that I think all that she said is exactly why we need to think of the whole earth. We do not think about setting aside nature and then having a place for people. People have to be intertwined with that nature in a variety of different ways and in a variety of different intensities. And it is only by doing that well that we're going to be able to conserve that much nature and develop rich relationships with it.
Okay, thank you. All right, here's a question that's come from the audience. It kind of relates to a number of the things we said, and they ask about gardens and agriculture, not for humans, but for the rest of biodiversity. And is there a place in our gardening for pollinating insects, for herbivores, for dispersers and such things? The question was a bit longer than that, but I think that's the general gist of it. Any thoughts about that? Gardening for the rest of the planet?
Yes. No, agreed. I mean, there's no doubt. And I think there's one lesson we've learned is nature can be resilient. And of course, the millenary practices that have been used by many of the indigenous communities in the Amazon are all about using some of the land and letting it return back, not only for fertility, but for other creatures in this area. I mentioned the example before of some of the marine communities and coastal communities in Fiji and others. So I think there's a lot of good examples there. So absolutely, this is about looking at it. I think one thing we haven't discussed, and when we think about restoration, I fully support the term in its true sense, restoring. And so many people think that restoring is just planting trees. Let us not ignore the power of natural regeneration. And I think as long as we have enough of these places left and seed banks and nearby forests and oceans and others, restoration can actually be a very effective way of bringing things back. I think David made the point of New England being a lot of it being natural regeneration, but there are things we can do to accelerate it. The challenge, of course, is that we do need to look at all of these things, protected areas, restoration, food systems, in view of climate change. I think that is something that's changing very fast. And of course, many of these areas are not going to be effective for that. And we're going to not only the question that pops up is what's the baseline we're trying to go back toward or restore toward? Because it's not going to be easy to go back to some of these old ecosystems. Many of them are not going to work. So I think it's going to require some adaptation and some new mechanisms, potentially including some new species that are going to potentially be part of the solution.
Sure.
So this is a very important area, but I do love the term rewilding. I think it's an important way of bringing nature back and giving it space. And I think if there's one lesson we've learned is if the conditions are right, it will come back.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I quickly
Go
want
ahead.
Kiani?
Sorry. I think this is the question that Natalie Adams had posed in the chat. And so I just briefly wanted to touch on this, especially because they had brought up specifically in Massachusetts. And I'm currently working on a project where I'm mentoring 4 high school students at Cambridge Latin High School. And they're creating a community garden and prioritizing planting indigenous species to hopefully bring in native insects as well, specifically bees and beetles and wasps. And so I think if you want to join the happy hour, I'm happy to chat about this more in depth, but there's a practice called the Three Sisters method, which is called a bunch of different things amongst different tribes, but that's what it's called here, the Punkanog tribe. And they basically plant 3 different native species together. So we have corn, squash, and beans all planted together. And it's supposed to, hopefully, we'll see, like once we get this garden up and running, if it increases the amount of wildlife that is attracted to the area. So if you want to chat more about the research I've done with those students, I'm happy to talk about it in the happy hour.
That sounds great. Okay. Here's a question that's kind of along those lines, but not exactly. We all are very familiar with pandemics and the spread of diseases, and that has a lot to do with protected areas and the interaction between people and species. Any thoughts as we go forward, how that is going to be added into the equation of what we're doing in terms of Half Earth?
I'll jump in since my
Okay.
previous job at the Wildlife Conservation Society, we did a lot of work in the wildlife health and the One Health concept.
Mhm.
And I think, let us not forget that so many of the diseases that we're looking at and confront are zoonotic in origin. Not all, but the majority are.
Yep.
I think one of the things that's been very clear is that a lot of these have to do with things like wildlife consumption, illegal wildlife trade. And there's no doubt that as we have more and more people living in the forest, the more people consuming, putting pressure on this, it really has a huge impact on this. One of the studies that we worked on about 3 years ago, early in the pandemic, was actually looking at the study of some forest rats in the markets of Vietnam. What's fascinating is when you looked at these things, it was actually doing samples. Some of the wild population of the rats, all of these have different kinds of diseases that they're carrying around. But as the supply chains start taking these rats and bringing them into the urban centers, they get piled up, combined, and things. They become perfect brewing areas. By the time you get these rats in the markets in Hanoi and other places, you literally have dozens of these viruses that were out there being used. So I think there's a real question here, and that's why controlling wildlife trade is a key area, especially for mammals and for some of the birds. I think that's a key issue. And the other thing we've learned is that as we move more into the forest, and there's good studies from India and others showing that, is that human wildlife face increases, just the probability of that spillover from wildlife populations into humans increases exponentially. So I think there's a lot of debate around this, but I think in general, very clearly, there are some precautionary things that we do that will help us reduce the likelihood of future spillovers and future pandemics. And a lot of what's being looked at is the concept that some of you know is the whole view of One Health, which I think is getting more and more traction, which ties back to the idea of sharing this planet with many other species and living in one nature.
There was one specific question for you, Jason, that I'd like you to address, and then we're going to go on to some other things. You said aquaculture is going in the wrong direction. And there's a couple of questions. What did you really mean by that? If you could give a brief answer to that.
I've been working on aquaculture at World Wildlife Fund since the early 90s, when I was asked to write a piece comparing shrimp aquaculture impacts to those of wild-caught shrimp. And it seemed to me at the time that even with the loss of mangroves up to that point attributed to shrimp aquaculture, the industry had learned a lot and could actually improve its impacts considerably if people adopted what was already known and then improved on that. The problem with shrimp trawling is the impact on benthic areas, which we're just now understanding is a potentially a big source of greenhouse gas emissions as well. But for aquaculture, it's the money comes in often before the science or the research is done, or from sources that aren't aware of what the impacts are. So you could have, for example, escapes, you could have disease transfers, you could have large use. In fact, one of the biggest fisheries today is for fish meal and fish oils, reduction fisheries. That's largely for the aquaculture industry. It takes about 8 to 14 kilos of fish to make 1 kilo of fish oil. And so you're beginning to see really large compounding of these impacts in aquaculture. If we're doing bivalves, they could clean up water, they could do a lot of different things. But even with bivalves and seagrass, or seaweed, we've seen that people often take other things out of the water in order to put those in. So it has impacts on biodiversity too. Nothing is really done without an impact, and we just have to be aware of that and understand what is more acceptable and what the trade-offs are. Okay, and a lot of times we rush without it.
Yeah. All right. I think that's what the person was trying to get at. Okay, we're in the last phase of our panel discussion here, and that's what we call calls to action. And it's a chance for each of you as panelists to just take a couple minutes each or less. And we've already talked about some of the actions and the lifestyle changes, but maybe if we could each say what you think we need to do next. So let's start, David, with you on that.
Great. So I'm going to focus in on one thing that should be near and dear to the hearts of this class act presentation, which is I would look to academic institutions. I think that academic institutions are misaligned in their focus, almost extreme focus on greenhouse gases and emissions and sustainability with relationship to that. Not that that's a bad thing, that's very good for addressing climate change, but it's missing the connection of all of this to the land. And there's very little focus within sustainability initiatives, within major forward-looking missions of academic institutions to both treating land well, that's within its own direct impact, and helping the different sectors of academia, the institutional leaders, the faculty, the students, and the alums actually mobilize in ways that can help to address land-based issues. And Harvard is a great example of this because there are relatively little resources and relatively few faculty who focus on land and water issues in the way that we're talking about them now. A tremendous number of focus on energy, tremendous numbers who focus on emissions and emission-related climate change and other kinds of impacts. And yet there's so much more that could be done towards using the resources of the university to make sure that we are doing the right thing by nature.
Great. I think, and that's something that Class Act can have an impact on. I really do. Okay, Jason, how about you?
I guess I would say help restore habitat and biodiversity in areas of use in any way you can, either by supporting efforts financially, by taking part in them, doing it yourself, or by voting for it.
Succinct. Thank you very much. Christian, your final thoughts on action.
I'm going to pick up on Jason's last point. First thing I would do is vote for the right people. Get the right people in the right offices that are going to actually bring about this change and get those people elected. Second is look to universities to train that next generation. Every single area of Harvard needs to train people that embrace this. Every profession is part of the solution. And the third issue for everyone on this call, just pick 3 things you can do them, and share them with at least 3 more people.
That'll exponentially add up for sure. Kiana, you have the last word here.
I just want to invite you all to critically think about the ideologies I posed earlier about concentric ecology and ask yourself what you can do to carry on this practice in your life. And as a starting point, I've gathered a list of supplemental readings, which are in the chat, and also some books, some of which, actually all of which are by Indigenous authors, and some pertaining specifically to island nations and others to the Amazon and the rest of the continent. And also to build off of what Dr. Foster said, I invite you to recognize the tribal nations that you currently reside on and find ways to get involved and support the environmental work and activism that they are already doing within your communities, because a lot of these institutions, like Harvard especially, are lacking these perspectives and these knowledges. And so I believe it'll be put in the chat, but there's a website called native-land.ca where you can find out which tribal land you live on, and you can find their website and contact them that way. But aside from the readings and I guess all of the education that we can do, I think I have 2 specific asks. The first is this past fall, me and 13 other undergrads created the Harvard Climate Coalition, which is an umbrella organization for all of the environmental groups on campus. And we connect with the grad school organizations, as well as the larger Boston community. And we are doing a lot of work to kind of bridge these gaps. And we have a lot of activities and panels and conversations that are open to our alumni as well. And so if you go to our website, you can get involved with us that way. And the last thing, which also I think goes back to what Dr. Foster said, is to encourage Harvard to, especially since you're alumni, I think as undergrad and as alumni, we have a lot of power to persuade the university to do good things. And I think that is to do what Dr. Foster said, is to get more professors and more classes focused around these conversations, and especially from the Indigenous perspective, because it's crucial to even talking about this and then coming up with solutions and inspiring the rest of my classmates to help fix this mess that we're all in together. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Okay, very nice, very nicely put. And I think that's why we're here. And when I hear all these comments and all these proposed actions, I think of all the work we have to do, but it's all doable. And I think that's what discussions like this help us understand. Currently, this Class Act 73 is going to initiate two major actions. I just wanted to mention those, and then we'll wrap it all up. One is we've decided to try to, in terms of protecting, is to strengthen and broaden land trusts from local to global areas, so we can actually put some things, I don't want to say behind bars, but some things that are permanently protected, and to share with people as well as the rest of biodiversity. And the second thing that we now have a major effort moving forward is to try to somehow orchestrate the final ratification by the US of the International Convention on Biological Diversity. Many of you may know that 197 countries have signed that treaty. One hasn't, and that's us, the US. And we feel like if we're going to have a seat at the table and we're going to make inroads in this, that we need to really ratify that treaty and get the Senate to do that. So that's another action that we're going to be moving forward. I would like to thank all you panelists. Great participation, great preparation, great responses. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Marion Dry, who's going to have a few final comments, and then she will invite you, but I'd like to invite you all to join us for the after forum salon, if you have any further questions for the panelists, or just want to chat amongst yourself, those of you that have been listening. Marion, back to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you all. What an extraordinary conversation, and I personally have learned so much and feel greatly inspired. Class Act always has a call to action as well, and we want to encourage every person watching to take action. Work on any of the calls to action our participants have suggested tonight. Join the Class Act work on the Biodiversity Treaty ratification and/or land trusts. And to join the efforts, please fill out the Google form that Diana has listed in the chat, or email us at classacthr73@gmail.com. We all know that for this, there is no time like the present. I want to thank all of you, John, Christian, David, Jason, and Kiani. You're just fantastic. So many different perspectives and so many important things to think about. My thanks also go to the members of our program and production teams, and they are, again, John Kress, Jason Clay, Andrea Kirsch, John Noren, Jackie Swearingen, Sarah Ulrich, Diana Labanchu, Katie Marinello, Kate Freed, and our videographer, Rick Brotman. And finally, thank you to all of you who joined us this evening.